my live teaching learning session. I am Riya Pramanik. Today we will be going to learn about a new subject, that is Indian government and politics. The subject code of this subject is PPSC 132. So let's start with this course. So in block 1, we will be reading about approaches to study Indian politics. So there are many approaches, many perspectives through which we used to study certain politics, like for example, Indian politics. So here in this block, we will be reading about three such approaches. That is, in unit 1, we will be reading about liberal approach. The next comes the Marxist approach, and the third one is the Gandhian approach. So let's move forward. In all these three approaches, we will be seeing what are the main elements of these approaches. So in first unit, we will be looking at liberal approach, where we will be studying about the core elements of liberal approach to study politics, and the changing scope of liberal approach. In Marxist approach, we will be looking at meaning and scope of Marxist approach, Marxist perspectives, and classes in rural areas. Then we will be looking about movements, peasants and farmer movements, working class movements, and then the Indian state. The last approach we will be looking today is Gandhian approach, that is meaning and scope of Gandhian approach and political science in India, social harmony, social movements, and impact of Gandhian philosophy on public policies. So all these things will be covered in today's session. So to start with, the Indian politics is a vast subject. So India's politics basically starts after independence. Before independence, India was a colony of British country, and then after 1947, we start reading Indian politics which is a very vast subject. So to understand what is Indian politics and how to look upon Indian politics, it is very difficult to understand without some ways or method. So to learn about some country's politics, we should know what are the perspectives. Like there are many perspectives through which we have to study these political history. So such ways are known as approaches or frameworks. So there are various approaches. As we already seen, we will be reading about three approaches today. So this block deals with three of such approaches. So let's start with liberal approach. That is unit 1 of this paper. So there are many elements of liberal approach. We are reading here the core elements of liberal approach, which is very necessary to understand this approach. So the first is institutions, that is political system and not the state. So the liberal approach prefer to use the term political system rather than the state for polity of a country. So liberal approach, they didn't prefer to use the term state. They want to use the term political system. So the system in this political system, it consists of certain institutions and structures such as political parties, interest groups, or civil society organizations. As we all know that India is a multi-party system. India has multi-party system where several political parties compete with each other. So this is also one of the institutions of Indian system. Then interest groups are there, civil society organizations are there. So these institutions or structures interact with social structures such as caste, language, religion, region, tribe, etc. So there is a link between the institutions and social structures such as caste, language, religion, etc. So due to their interaction, as we read that there is an interaction between these political institutions and social structures. So due to their interaction, certain processes occur where different components of an organization conflict and cooperate and reach a consensus. So when they interact with each other, there is a scope of conflict. So they cooperate. How they cooperate? So through a consensus, they reach a consensus from which they can cooperate. So deliberations and discussions are necessary. So political institutions generally include political parties, pressure groups, legislature, and executive. So these are all the political institutions which the liberal approach talks about. So this liberal approach dominated the study of Indian politics for around 4 decades from the 1950s. So since 1950s, as India got independence in 1947, soon after that, liberal approach was in that was dominating the political system. So the next come the processes. The next core element of liberal approach is processes. So among the processes which this approach studies are the functions which are performed by different institutions or organizations. So here in this process, we are saying about the functions which are performed by all these different institutions like political parties, interest groups, civil society. So these are conceptualized as political mobilization, interest articulation, and interest aggregation. So with the reference to progress of democracy, the processes are also referred to as democratization. So these processes are very necessary for a democracy to run in a proper way. So this is referred to as democratization, deepening and consolidation of democracy. So these progress like political mobilization, interest articulations are very necessary to deepen democracy in a country and it consolidate the democracy. So the liberal approach views politicization of people as democratization through electoral mobilization and political participation. So here, electoral mobilization is how people are going to vote, how people are aware, is the people are aware or not, and how they are participating in the political processes. All these things comes under democratization process. So by the late 1960s, the process of democratization had begun to affect the lower social orders and has been continuing since then. So from the late 1960s, we can see that this process of democratization is started to affecting the lower social orders. So, and from then onwards, it was continuing. So consequently, India's traditional and semi-feudal society moved towards liberty and equality. Next come the values. The third core element of liberal approach includes values, that is liberty, human rights, and equalities. So these three things are very important in a democracy, and liberal approach also talks about these values like liberty, human rights, and equalities. So it is more about individual or community rights. So it not only talks about individuals but also about community rights, and it says that it is the duty of the state to provide protection to the vulnerable sections, ethnic groups, scheduled tribes, and minorities. So it is believed that the state is formed to protect the vulnerable sections of the society, such as people from lower castes, who belong to lower castes, or who belong to poor section of the society, who belong to marginalized section of the society, the minorities, whether religious minority or caste minorities or scheduled tribes. So all these vulnerable sections are to be protected by the state. So liberal approach advocates individual rights and freedom, but it also advocates protection of communities, especially their language, culture, and script. So we can see that there are many languages in India, and the state performs many duties to promote these languages, cultures, and scripts through various fairs organized all over India. So democratic rights cannot be saved without safeguarding these values in a nation like India. So all these values are very necessary to be preserved, without which the Indian state will not be democratic in such a manner, because for a democracy, all these values are very necessary, very essential. So it is believed that state should provide all these values to the citizens. So let's start with liberal approach to study politics. So the liberal approach, when applied to study Indian politics, can also be called systemic approach. So you are requested not to get confused between liberal approach and systemic approach. Liberal approach is also known as systemic approach. So system approach emerged out of a broad movement in social sciences known as behavioral movement. So in the 1960s, 1970s, this behavioral movement started, and from then onwards, it was known as systemic approach. So it was introduced by David Easton and James S. Coleman to study political systems in the developing countries in the 1950s and 1960s. So soon after Second World War, when all the continents were a part of the World War II. So at that point of time, the countries, the colonizers become very weak. And also, this was the time when all the colonized countries were revolting against their colonizers. So, as a result of which, after the Second World War, many countries got independence from their colonizers from continents like Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And this was the time when India was also got its independence. Not only India, there were many countries who were independent in this time period after the Second World War, which ended in the year 1945. So, with this newly independent countries coming up in the world politics, so this framework started to study these newly independent countries which were developing. They were not developed, they were developing countries. So the systemic approach started to study about these developing countries in 1950s and 1960s. So this framework was also came to be known as modernization or development framework. So there are many names given to this approach or this framework of study. So its main purpose was to study development of modern political institutions in developing societies. So since these newly independent countries were just independent from their colonizers, they were very new in policy making and running the government. So there were many challenges which these countries were facing at that point of time. So the purpose of this liberal approach was to study how the modern political institutions were developed in these newly independent states. So it was a new approach because earlier only European countries were the focus of all these kinds of studies. But since the 1945 event, when the World War ended, this was the time when many newly independent countries emerged, and the study focuses on these countries. So its main focus has been to see political institutions or organizations development maintain themselves by reaching consensus within the factions of organizations. So this was the liberal approach to study politics. So in this approach, the political system comprises of political institutions, structures, and processes. So with the term political system, it says that how the political institutions are running, what are the structures, and what are their processes. So these three attributes keep interacting, conflicting, and adjusting with each other, balancing and counterbalancing to themselves. So these three attributes, which are political institutions, structures, and processes, they keep interacting within a system, and they also conflict with each other, and then they adjust with each other. So they keep interacting and they keep finding new ways to solve the problems. So during the initial period of independence, many political scientists have followed this approach to study Indian politics. So there were many scientists in India, outside also. After independence of a country, they started to learn the country's structure through this approach. So the liberal approach has undergone transformation after the 1970s. So since 1970s, this liberal approach undergone a transformation, and it no longer averse to using the concept of the state instead of political system. So now the perspective had little bit changed with time, and the state have been viewed as an autonomous institution. It functions independently of and in the interest of all groups and classes. This approach is called statist approach. So with 1970s transformation, we can see that liberal approach were not averse to use the term state. So they see state as an autonomous institution which functions independently and in the interest of all the groups or classes or the citizens of a particular country. So this approach started to be called as statist approach. So there are changing scope of liberal approach. So the first one is civil society. The liberal approach views the role of civil society organizations in relation to democratic rights of individuals. As we learned about civil society, so civil society is a society where people voluntarily participates and work. So in this kind of civil societies, liberal approach believes that it enhances the democratic rights of individuals because they themselves are participating with their will. So, civil society is a space that exists between the family and the state. So, outside family and within the state, so there is a gap. So, civil society fills that gap that exists between family and state. So, this approach helped to explain the role of these organizations in democratization of the society or protection of the rights of individuals and groups in the society. As civil society is a group of people who are voluntarily uh, participating in a group like that, so it is believed that it enhances democracy because people are using their will, they are doing what they want to do, and they are participating on their own. So in this kind of a society, the democratization process enhances. Also, it talks about the protection of the rights of the individuals and also the groups in the society. Next comes multiculturalism. So, liberal approach recognizes the rights of not only individuals but also groups. As we already studied in previous slides, that liberal approach is not only about individuals but it also talks about groups, communities. So, in a diverse society, especially a country like India, recognition of rights of diverse groups, right to representation and distributed justice is indicative of multiculturalism. As we all know, India is a very diverse country where different religions, different cultures, different languages, all the people belonging to different identities reside in a country. So when all the rights of these diverse groups are ensured, like right to representation, distributive justice, so it indicates multiculturalism. So it means that they grow up and live within a culturally structured world. So these cultural communities generally demand various kind of rights to maintain their collective identity. So, for example, a group wanted to be they want their language to be recognized. Why? Because that is their identity. Their language is their identity. Their dress code is their identity. Their food habits is their identity. So these cultural communities generally demand various kinds of rights. So multiculturalism is necessarily associated with democracy. It either guarantees or attempts to provide cultural rights of religious rights. So we can see that there are many languages, there are many scripts belonging to different tribal groups and different ethnic groups. So all these things to be preserved so that it will enhance the Indian history, that how diverse India is. Next comes the social capital. Since the 1990s, the concept of social capital has been used to explain nature of relations among communities. So it tries to explain the relation between the communities. It denotes existence of networking among people in a group or a community who share common values and trust each other. Trust is very important between these communities and they share common values. So the rise of new social movement, civil societies, and realization of the importance of studying substantive democracy has added to the significance to this perspective. So this is about social capital. Next, we will be moving forward to the Marxist approach to study Indian politics. So let's start with meaning and scope of Marxist approach. So Marxist approach to Indian politics is guided by basic tenets of Marxism. So, the theory Marxism comes from Karl Marx, and this Marxist approach are guided by the basic tenets of Marxism. So, these tenets attempt to interpret society in such a way that it helps to change the society. So, it tries to interpret a society to change the society. So, this is all about Marxism. So, the relation between classes can be viewed in terms of social relations of production and forces of production. And together, these are known as mode of production. So, Marxism talks about the relation between classes. The classes it talks about in a capitalist society are the bourgeoisie and the proletariat class. So, these classes, social relations, Marxism talks about the relations of production and forces of production. So, this together known as mode of production. So, change in means of production or in the forces of production lead to the transformation of society. As we have learned about historical materialism, in that we can I told you about that how with the means of productions change, this society evolved into different stages. So from primitive communism to slavery, then slavery to feudalism, then capitalism. So because of the transformation of the means of production, the society developed into different stages. So the core of Marxist approach is to explain the relationship between base and superstructure. So Marxists believe that whatever there is in the base, it will impact or it will influence the superstructure. So this approach views internal politics of a country in relation to international politics. So whatever is going on in the world politics, the Marxist approach will relate that from the internal politics of a particular country. So, Marxist perspective and classes in rural areas. So, according to Marxist approach, the classes in agriculture in India have been identified in the following ways. So, Marxist talks about the classes in rural areas because agriculture, it takes account of agriculture. So, they identified following ways through which the classes in agriculture have been identified. So the first thing which they talks about is that who owns the land. It is like which class owns the land, who owns the tools and the instruments to cultivate the land, who works in the land, and what is the nature among those who work in the land or the wage distribution. So all these following ways, the Marxist approach, according to Marxist approach, the classes in agricultural India have been identified through these particular 4-5 ways. So, the rural rich own land and other resources. They gradually do not work in the land. So, the person who is owning the land and who have all the resources like tools, instruments to cultivate the land, so they will not generally work in their own land, and they get the work done by wage laborers. So here the question arises that who owns the land? The rural rich owns the land. Who owns tools and instruments to cultivate the land? It is the rural rich community who owns these tools and instruments. And if we ask about who works in the land, it is the wage laborers who works in the land. It is not the rural rich who works in their own land. So the rural poor either own no land or own land and other resources which are insufficient to meet family needs. So this the rich owners, we have already talked about that they own the land, they own the resources, but the rural poor either they don't own any land, or if they own any land, the resources, so they are insufficient to run a family. So they have to work in others' land or at any other places. So rural poor are required to work in other places because their land is not enough if they have land, and if they don't have land, so there is no scope without working, so they need to work in others' land or in some other places. So the Marxist perspective generally undermines the role of caste in identifying classes. So the Marxist perspective, they don't regard to caste in identifying classes. Moving away from this trend, there was a Marxist scholar, very famous Marxist scholar, Gail Ombed. who observed that class divisions in rural society are intertwined in caste hierarchies. So the basic Marxist perspective don't consider caste in this in identifying classes, but there is a Marxist scholar, Gail Ormwet, who talks about the intersectionality between caste and class. So let's talk about movements. Since Marxism is sympathetic to lower classes, agricultural, laborers, working classes, or peasantry, it aims to end class exploitation. So the basic thing which is there in Marxism is that they are very sympathetic to the people who are rural poor or who belong to lower classes like agricultural laborers, working class, peasantry, workers, laborers, and that is why it aims to end class exploitation because according to Marxism, it is because of the class distinction between rich and poor, owner of the land and who works in the land, that this kind of discrimination and exploitation emerges. So Marxist approach emphasizes in studying material conditions of classes and their social relations and attempt by them to improve their conditions. So their attempts include collective action. So Marxists believe that to remove these kinds of exploitative habits of rich classes, it is very important to there should be some kind of unity between these classes. So they include collective action or movements of different classes. So they talks about movement, revolution. So these movements happened in both colonial and post-colonial periods. So with regard to Indian politics, these kinds of movements were seen in both colonial period and after independence, post-colonial. So let's start with peasants and farmers movement. So although peasants and farmers are generally used interchangeably, so these two terms are generally interchangeably used, but there is a difference between them which we need to understand. So peasant is a generic category. Farmer is used for agriculturists who use modern technology and are more resourceful than the peasants. So it is believed that the farmers have modern technology to use in their land and they are more resourceful than a peasant. So the prime focus in peasant studies has been to identify classes in agriculture, process of class formation, social and economic relations in terms of rent collection, indebtedness, nature of social oppression, and economic exploitation. So whenever there is a kind of peasant studies, they used to focus on all these things. For example, the process of class formation, indebtedness, nature of social oppression, and economic exploitation, which was done in a very large number in rural areas. So, during the colonial period in India, Marxist approach identified broadly following classes. So, during British period, Marxist identified few classes such as peasant working as tenants on the lands owned by the landlords, moneylenders, and officials of the colonial government. So these were the classes at that point of time in colonial period. So who were they? The peasant working as tenants on the land owned by the landlords, moneylenders, and officials of the colonial government. So here the word moneylender means who lends money to poor people. But in ancient India, since ancient India and then before independence, we can see that these moneylenders were very exploitative in nature. They used to lend money, and ask uh, in return they ask a huge amount, which are not like it is not in a proper sense. Uh, so suppose if a person is lending 50 rupees, so the money lenders used to charge 250 rupees in return in a very high interest. So they used to exploit the poor. So it also explained the Marxist approach also explained the ways tenants are exploited. So they talk about the ways through which the landlords exploited the tenants working on their land. So how they were exploited? eviction from land for being unable to pay rent and debt. So whenever a person is unable to pay rent or the debt, they were evicted from the land. So this was one of the kind of exploitation that tenants were facing. Next is physical coercion. Physical coercion by beating them, by slapping them, by kicking them. So they were evicted from the land and they were exploited. Next comes the caste based humiliation that was very prevalent in our India. So, through caste based humiliation, people were exploited. And how the exploiting classes, the landlords, who were the exploiting classes? The landlords, money lenders, colonial authorities allied with each other. So, these were the people who generally exploited the tenants through all these methods. So, in post-independent era, the focus of Marxist approach shifted to the study of politics of land reforms, movement for implementation of land reforms, and the impact of land reforms. So, after independence, the focus shifted. Scholars using Marxist approach have attempted to study class character of these movements and link them with political economy of capitalism in agriculture. So for them, they are movement of the rural rich who are embedded in agrarian capitalism. So let's move forward to working class movement. So earlier we read about peasant and farmers movement. Now we are moving forward towards the working class movement. So, for studying working class or trade union movements, Marxist perspective addresses the following issues. So, there are many issues that they address in relate to the working class or trade union movements. So, the first issue is growth of working class, their social and economic conditions. Next comes the fulfillment of their basic needs, whether their basic needs are being fulfilled or not. So in basic need, what comes in? That is food, housing, education, health, etc. So these are the basic needs, or whether they are fulfilling or not, it is a concern of the Marxist approach. So next comes the payment of wages, bonus, right to organize and set up their organizations, facilities for creches for workers' children, the factors that lead to workers' movement. So, what are the factors which leads to a workers' movement is also an issue which the Marxist approach addresses. The influence of ideological and political movements on workers' organizations, response of the state, how state is responding towards these kinds of movement is also one of the main issues that they address, and owners of the firms where striking workers are engaged. So, in the time after independence, we can see there were many incidents like this where the trade union announced strikes against the state or the mill owner or factory owner. So, it is also seen that how the state or the company or the factory owners are reacting towards these strikes. So, next comes the Indian state, how Indian state is seen by the Marxist approach. So, the state is a sovereign political institution in a country as of the bourgeois class or for the propertied classes. So Marxists believe that the state is an instrument in the hands of the bourgeois class. So it is different from the way political system, as the term is used for the state is seen in the liberal approach. So there is a difference. So the Marxist approach views state as representative of class interest and seeks to find out how different classes are related to the state in terms of controlling it and influencing the state policy. So basically, Marxist approach believes that the rich classes or the privileged classes used to control and influence the working of the states and also influences the policy making and in decision making, which ultimately favors the particular rich class only and not the poor class. So it attempts to see how state formulates its policy about the propertied and poor class. So they focuses on the policies formulated by the state, which will be for the propertied class and the poor class, and what is the difference between the policies formed by the state towards these two classes. So the Marxist approach seeks to trace the development of the state and to see the ideological influences or orientation of the state. What is the ideology of a particular state at a particular time? So this is also one of the concern of the Marxist approach. So it attempts to link the policies of a state with international political economy. As we learned in the previous slide, that how Marxist approach not only talks about internal politics, but also it is concerned about the world politics. So here we can see that it links the policy of a state with the international political economy, especially the financial institutions such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, that is known as IMF in short. So they link the internal policies of a country with the international political economy. So these were the two approaches we already learned, that is liberal approach and the Marxist approach. Let's move forward to the Gandhian approach. So starting with meaning and scope of Gandhian approach. So the Gandhian approach denotes using the Gandhian tenets. So here Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's viewpoints are used as a perspective, as an approach to study the Indian politics. So as we all know that Mahatma Gandhi is the father of the nation, and his ideology or his ideas were different from other approaches. So it is very important for us to know the Indian politics through his eyes, through his perspectives, and through this approach. So the Gandhian approach which we are talking about denotes using Gandhian tenets or Gandhism to explain the social reality or truth and suggest ways to build new society. So for a society to grow, this is a approach which see what is the social reality. They try to explain it. So the tenets, the main tenets of this Gandhian approach are truth, non-violence, satyagraha, swaraj, sarvodaya, justification of means to achieve goals, ethics, morality, and Ram Rajya. So here non-violence is more than just avoidance of violence. As we know, non-violence means without using any violence. But Gandhian approach says that non-violence is more than just avoidance of violence and harming others. It is to harm oneself. So to harm oneself through activities such as fasting is to exercise moral authority on those who possess power. So here fasting is also a very crucial thing or issue in Gandhian approach. So without disobedience, a political action cannot be organized. Democracy must be structured in a way that every citizen can question law and institutions. So what he said, that democracy should be structured in such a way that people, the citizens of a particular country, can question the law and institutions. So this is one of the major things which democracy provides, that is expressions of views. So to use non-violent and moral or ethical tool to achieve goals means to follow a method or a strategy which is known as satyagraha according to Gandhism. So what is satyagraha? It is a way to achieve a goal without using violent means and through moral or ethical tool. So it is all about satyagraha. The ultimate goal of Gandhian tenets seek to achieve is establish Swaraj or self-control or self-realization. So Gandhi talks about self-control, which is a very important tenet of his ideas. So he wanted a society which is based on self-control or self-realization, and it will be known as a Swaraj. So this will lead to formation of a Ram Rajya or a society where people live in peace and harmony. So with Ram Rajya, he meant an ideal society where there will be peace and harmony among all the people, irrespective of their religion, caste, and other identities, and they govern themselves and they enjoy security. So that is the definition of Ram Rajya given by Gandhi. So it is an ideal society, as I already talked about this, that Ram Rajya is an ideal society. People self-regulate, self-govern through village panchayats and village republics. So the panchayat, village panchayat is very much promoted by Gandhi, and because of him, because of his views about panchayat and village republics, it is also present in our directive principles of state policies, which we'll be learning in our upcoming sessions. So it is a high civil society. The Ram Rajya he talks about is a high civil society. Such societies have compassion between citizens and fellow feeling. So there will be no hatred, there will be no jealousy towards others, but there will be compassion and fellow feeling among the citizens of the particular country. So in Ram Rajya, the village panchayat performs the functions which can be performed by the state. So Gandhi is not so much like he is not in favor of a state, but he talks about village panchayat which can also perform the works done by a state. So he promotes village panchayats more as compared to states. So Ram Rajya or Swaraj implies the minimal role of the state, which is coercive institution. So according to Gandhi, the state is a coercive institution where it can use coercive methods like violence and other methods to run the country. So in place of a state, Gandhi wanted a village panchayat, and it wants the state's role to be very minimal. So Gandhian approach and political science in India. So how Gandhian approach influences political science in India is a very important thing to understand. So in political science, the most common themes which have been studied by Gandhian approach are the following. So social movements and usage of satyagraha in them, critique of Indian state as coercive institutions, that Indian state should be Indian states will be coercive, and in that place we should have village panchayats which will be running efficiently. Also the notion of Swaraj. Also the Gandhian approach talks about communal and social harmony. So during the national movement, we can say that before the partition or during independence, there were many riots happening all over India, and they were so violent in nature that Gandhi appealed to people for communal and social harmony. But still, instead of that, also there were many incidences where all these riots were going on. So there was a very much need for Indian society to be communal and social harmony to be there. So also Gandhian approach talks about decentralization through Panchayati Raj institutions or the 73rd or 74th Constitutional Amendment Acts. So Gandhian way is to use to assess the influence of Gandhism on intellectuals such as Charan Singh, Ram Manohar Lohia, and other socialist leaders. So many leaders were also influenced by these Gandhi's ideas. So Lohia and Charan Singh attacked industrialization in favor of small scale or village industry, which Gandhi talks about. So Gandhi's he wanted small industries or village industries which are in small scale to flourish. So in Gandhian perspective, the state has generally been viewed as a soulless machine which uses coercive methods. So for Gandhi, the state is a soulless machine and it has power to use coercive method which he doesn't want to happen, and that is why he wanted a very minimal role of the state. So Gandhian perspective seeks to explain the extent to which state is required to provide security. So for Gandhi, for the Gandhian perspective, state is necessary to provide security. So through all these things, we should understand that Gandhi is not opposed to the state, Instead, he supports minimum state, which will be providing security to the people. So, for security purposes, Gandhi wanted state, but in other things, he wanted a very minimum role of the state. So, the role of the state can be performed by Panchayati Raj institutions. So, Gandhi focuses on Panchayati Raj institutions, and he argued that all the roles played by the state should be performed by Panchayati Raj institutions instead. So, state should perform minimum functions, and Gandhism supports a kind of democracy in which people share power and participate in decision-making process through Panchayati Raj institutions. So, he wanted people to participate in decision-making in policy formations through Panchayati Raj institutions. So, Gandhi talks about social harmony. So, the question how Gandhism has helped to combat communal polarization. So, as I told you that during the our independence time or during partition, there were several communal rights going on between Hindus and Muslims because the India was divided into two countries, India and Pakistan, and there were huge riots going on, and the areas which were severely affected was Punjab and West Bengal. Now West Bengal, because earlier the Bangladesh, which was known as East Pakistan, was a part of India, but later it got divided and became a part of Pakistan. Later on in 1971, it became an independent country that is known as Bangladesh. So this was the time when communal riots were going on, and especially in Noakhali riot, which was very famous because of the severity. So the question how Gandhism has helped to combat communal polarization has been used by historians, especially with reference to Noakhali riots. So Noakhali nowadays is in Bangladesh. So the question which was addressed in Noakhali was if Gandhi's doctrine was failing and how idea was of conversion made to justify violence. So the violence were so severe, so intense that many questions were arising on Gandhi's principles. So in case of Noakhali riots, the historians have attempted to see the impact of Gandhian method of satyagraha to achieve communal harmony. So it was so despite the fact Gandhi was criticized both by Hindus and Muslims. So because of all these communal rights, all the anarchy that was there during the partition time and during independence of both India and Pakistan, so Gandhi was criticized by both the communities, Hindus and Muslims. So the Gandhian perspective attempts to analyze how different communities can be brought together in situations of communal strife. So, one of the main major work undertaken by the Gandhian perspective or Gandhi himself was to see how these different communities who are fighting among themselves over their religion, over their pride, how to brought them together in a situation of communal strife. So, this was one of the major duty of Gandhi's perspective or Gandhi himself. So, let's talk about how Gandhi's principles influenced some social movements post independence. So, there is Gujarat movement in 1974 was launched by the students against inflated mess bills, took up varieties of issues. So, there was a movement in the year 1974 in Gujarat which was launched by the students living in hostels. So, they were very much against the inflated mess bills, and through this mess bills inflations they took up varieties of issues like corruption, black marketing, price rise, denationalization, civil liberties. So this agitation forced the Gujarat chief minister at that point of time, Chiman Bhai Patel, to resign. So the movement was so severe at that time that the chief minister has to resign from his post. So it later got linked with JP movement, the Jayaprakash movement that was going on. So this agitation was linked with that, and it provided a background to imposition of emergency in the year 1975. So in the year 1975, the emergency was announced by Indira Gandhi government, and the movement which was going on in 1974 was one of the event before happening before the imposition of the emergency. So some scholars underlines the importance of satyagraha and non-violence in farmers' movements and in movements against corruption. So there are many movements occurred in India where Gandhi's principles were used. So Gandhian like Subbarao and Rajgopal, PV and JP Narayan used Gandhian ways to convince dacoits in Chambal. So we can also see that to convince the dacoits of Chambal. Chambal is a very famous place for dacoits. So Subbarao and Rajgopal, PV, JP Narayan, they used Gandhian ways to convince them and to surrender abjuring violence and follow non-violence, to mobilize the youth in Bihar. So not only they convinced dacoits in Chambals, but they also used Gandhian ways to mobilize the youths in Bihar in the JP movement against corruption and against emergency. So also Bal Gopal founded Ekta Parishad to mobilize tribals against encroachment of their land and for granting land rights to them. So we can see that how Gandhi's ways, his ideas like truth, non-violence, satyagraha, swaraj, all these things were used by movements after independence also. So this Ekta Parishad is inspired by Gandhian philosophy of non-violence and non-cooperation. So over 3 decades from the 1990s, Ekta Parishad took up various issues like wages, migration, bonded labor, rehabilitation, employment, etc. to work upon this. So there are many impacts of Gandhian philosophy on public policies. For example, let's see what are the impacts of Gandhian philosophy. So the Janta government's policy, Janta Party government, which came after emergency period, they attempted to replace Nehruvian model of development. So their idea was to replace the Nehruvian model of development, which was going on since independence. Through such policies, India was supposed to become a nation more of farmers than of bureaucrats. So these are some examples of the impacts of Gandhism on state policies. Charan Singh attacked Nehruvian model views on alternative model of development, giving priority to agriculture, village community and small scale industries. So basically Nehruvian model talks about industries, factories and all the modernization and new technologies, whereas Charan Singh attacked this Nehruvian model and they wanted to give priority to agriculture, village community and small scale industries, and can be viewed to be cast in Gandhian framework. So because Gandhi talks about village industries, small scale industries, so this change from Nehruvian model to Gandhian framework we can see from this. So using Gandhian approach, Rahul Ramagundam underlines role of material and ethics in sustenance of life. The material aspect was influenced by Nehruvian philosophy and ethical by the Gandhian. So we can see that how Gandhian philosophy still impacts the policies, the public policies happening nowadays also. So after Gandhi's impact was so, Gandhi's views were so important for Indian politics that it still impacts. So to revise whatever we have read in our session today, so let's talk from the initial slide. So we started from liberal approach, how to study the Indian politics through liberal approach. Then we moved on to see what are the changing scope of liberal approach such as civil society, multiculturalism and all. So we also read about how the liberal approach allows us to study the politics in India, how it not only talks about individuals but also communities, and it has undergone transformation after the 1970s. So initially they didn't want it to be called as states, but they wanted to be called as political system. But later on they changed this perspective, and now they see state as an autonomous institution which functions independently and in favor of and in the interest of all the groups and classes residing in a particular country. So this approach is known as statist approach. So further, we read about the civil society, multiculturalism. For example, like in multiculturalism, because India is a society where diverse groups reside together, there are diverse cultures, languages, there are many tribes who are different from each other residing in India. So it was a need to provide some kinds of right to representation and distributed justice to these diverse groups so that they can also develop themselves, they can also come forward and participate in policy making and decision making. So, multiculturalism is associated with democracy. It guarantees cultural rights of religious and linguistic minority people. So, we also talked about social capital, the rise of social movements. Then we move forward in today's session about the Marxist approach. And this Marxist approach, which we know that is guided by the tenets of basic Marxism. So, for them, it says that it is the class which is a tool or the instrument in the hands of the rich people, and it do all the things according to that, because the rich owning or the land owning classes influences the state's work towards the citizens. So it talks about that. Also it says that how classes are identified. They says that because the person who is owning the land, who is owning the resources, who have tools, and who is working on the land separates each class from the others. So they talks about rural areas, they talks about agriculture, the means of production, and all these things. So they talks about rural poor, whether they own land or not, whether they are working on others. So the Marxist perspective don't consider caste in identifying classes, but we can see that there are many scholars, Marxist scholars like Gail Ombed, who talks about the intersectionality between class and caste, how class divisions in rural society are intertwined by the caste hierarchies also. So we also talked about different kinds of movements before independence and after independence. There were many approaches which talks about movement. There were peasants and farmer movement that were happening in colonial period also and after that also. And also we learned about the two different distinctions between peasants and farmers movement. So peasant is considered to be a generic category, whereas farmer particularly use techniques, modern technology, and they are more resourceful than the peasants. So the Marxist approach talks about how how the class formation processes and to identify classes in agricultural rural lands, and then they see what are and how the poor people are harassed or they are exploited by the rich landowning classes. So they use rent, so they evict the persons from the land for being unable to pay rent or debt. Physical coercion was also used, caste based humiliation was also used. And then we move forward to working class movements and how Marxist approach impacts the Indian state. Then we move forward to Gandhian approach, which is a very important thing to understand Indian politics, because Gandhi plays a very important role in shaping India's politics since now. So, Gandhi's the main tenets of Gandhian approach is non-violence, satyagraha, swaraj, sarvodaya, and they want a Ram Rajya to be established in the society. And with for Ram Rajya, what they talk about, it is an ideal society where there will be peace and harmony among all the citizens of the people, irrespective the differences on caste basis or religion basis. So they don't like Gandhi. For Gandhi, the society should be very peaceful and there should be social harmony among people, irrespective of their identities. So further, we also say that he wanted an ideal place where there will be village panchayats who will be performing all the functions. So the basic tenets, we can say that the notion of Swaraj, they criticized Indian state because they want a minimum role of the state in Indian politics, whereas all the work done by a state should be done by the village panchayats. So we can see that because of Gandhi's ideas about village panchayats, we have Panchayati Raj institutions in India through 73rd and 74th amendments in our country, and also in directive principles of state policy, there is a provision where village communities or village panchayats will be given importance. So all these things were the Gandhi's view, which we inherited in our constitution. Also, we can see that how Gandhi's ideas helped stop the communal rights also, and it was not able to stop it, but it impacted people in a very influential way because it talks about non-violence and harmony. So this is all about what we have studied in today's session. In our next session tomorrow, we will be discussing about unit 4, that is the basic features, which is very important topic, and I will be discussing about this unit in tomorrow's class. So thank you.